Hello, and welcome to this little experiment, where I try the video essay format for the first time. My usual content consists of base covers, but I decided that I wanted to try new things. And seeing how I love video games and I love music, I decided to do something that combines both. I actually tried filming this video with a much looser script, but I ended up hating the final product, so I scrapped it and made this instead. Though I mainly make videos for my own enjoyment and just general self-expression, videos like these take a lot of time and effort, and so if you do like it, please let me know, as that would encourage me to invest more work and time into them. And just a reminder before we jump in, if you are seeing ads on this video, blame YouTube, because apparently they add ads that they profit off of on videos that are not supposed to be monetized, so... As the title suggests, these are my favorite video game original soundtracks, often abbreviated to OSTs. This is simply my opinion based on what I've played since I started playing video games at age 3. I'm sure there will be soundtracks that I forgot about or that I don't know about, though I'd like to think that the forgettable ones wouldn't make it onto this list anyway, just by virtue of being forgettable. If, based on the games I mentioned in this video, you think there are more soundtracks that I do not know about that I might like, feel free to comment them down below. Also, as an additional disclaimer, this isn't a serious review of the music and the components of the music and the music theory behind these soundtracks. There are much more knowledgeable people and YouTubers that know a lot more about music theory than I do. This is simply about my opinion and why I like these video game soundtracks. So number 5 goes out to one of my favorite action-adventure isometric games of all time. Some of that is probably nostalgia, as it was the first game I remember paying for with my own money, even after having downloaded it prior using the way of the swashbuckling buccaneer. Bastion was Darren Korb's first experience with composing for video games. He then went on to compose the soundtracks for all the following Supergiant games, namely Transistor, Pyre, and most recently Hades. Bastion remains my favorite Supergiant game, but also has my favorite soundtrack. The theme, in many ways, echoes the game itself and its setting. Its bluegrass and the American folk do a great job in giving more flair to the world that the developers created, where the protagonist, the kid, navigates a dying world that mixes some classic fantasy visuals with the American frontier, and a narrator with a strong Southern American accent to boot. It's hard for me to put it into words, but just try listening to a Slinger song without not only nodding your head to the very pronounced drums reminiscent of hip-hop percussion, but also imagining yourself heading out to the ranch and herding some cattle around. And while Bastion has no cattle, no cowboys, no ranches, and no racist depictions of Native Americans and Mexicans, its soundtrack fits the game like a Smith & Wesson in an Oklahoman holster, or something. It also has a carbine as a playable weapon that makes you feel like a goddamn Deadeye. My two favorite songs from the OST are the Slinger song and Spike on a Rail, both of which are the best in relaying the bluegrass/western feel that the entire game conveys. Civilization 6 holds the number 4 spot on my list. Because the OST borrows so much from different folk and traditional music from all around the world, one could make the argument that it is not an original soundtrack and that all it does is appropriate a bunch of cultures, but don't let that fool you. It does the thing where when you start the game in 4000 BC, simple acoustic music starts playing. Very simple. You might recognize some of the songs, especially if you're familiar with one or more of the civilizations that are in the game that you are playing. The more you play, and the further you advance, until you get to the medieval era, and you notice that the music has changed. The arrangement is more complex, more instruments, fuller chords, and faster tempos. The music has evolved along with your civilization, and it is such a great example of adaptive video game music. For those of you who don't know, adaptive music is background video game music whose volume, rhythm, or tune changes in response to a specific event in the games. Sometimes those changes are obvious, such as the music immediately changing when you start a boss fight, or when you move on from one area to another, but other times the transition is done so smoothly and cleverly that you cannot help but admire the composers and music engineers that worked on the soundtrack. And Civ 6, playing you the same song but with radically different arrangements, depending on which stage of the game you are in, seems simple, but it is so effective at engrossing you further into the one more turn state of mind of building your own empire and watching it grow from a couple of people with clubs to a global superpower that keeps making Pedro II of Brazil mad because you have more great people than he does. What the hell's your deal, Pedro? If you want more great people, just get more great people. Don't get mad at me for having more universities than you overgrown bearded baby. Anyway, not only does every single civilization get its own main themes, and some of them have additional mini-songs added on top of their main song, all of them have 4 distinct versions in distinct styles. And all of these civilizations span the entire planet, meaning that while the American or the Canadian themes require banjos and acoustic guitars to play, the Indian themes has sitars and tablas, the Egyptian themes has ouds and darbukas, and so on. In the ancient version of the Russian theme, you can even hear the Belailaka players breathing in the recording, and you can hear the small imperfections in the Grand Colombia's ancient soundtrack, which is performed with a flute, maybe a pan flute, I'm not really sure. Which makes me think about how much effort and resources went into getting professional players of all of these instruments, either the classical Western ones, or the traditional instruments from all over the world, all of them to play songs from their countries of origin in order to make this monster of a soundtrack. Not that Civ 6's soundtrack needs the extra brownie points, but when comparing it with other strategy games' soundtracks, it is far, far ahead of anything else that I have played. Strategy games do not generally have the most memorable or inventive soundtracks, but Civ 6, with the help of its massive budget, really went the extra mile in making something beautiful and that does not feel as repetitive as other strategy games, which are often stuck repeating the same songs over and over, which is something that comes with the territory of making games where there isn't much focus on a narrative movement that the soundtrack could use for its own progression and diversity. Now, I'm not saying that Civ 6's soundtrack does not repeat, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it gets a bit grating, but it does it so much better than other soundtracks. This incredible versatility in genres and musical influences, along with how well integrated it is with the gameplay, made me immediately fall in love with the game's soundtrack. Some of my favorite themes that I encourage you to check out if you don't know about them would be Brazil, or Russia's theme, maybe Sweden's themes. The Witcher 3 holds the 3rd place on my list, conveniently. Like all other entries on this list, the soundtrack has so much character and personality. It is unique as an entry on this list, however, in that it is the only open world game in the modern sense. This is relevant in one major way for my purposes. A lot of the tracks are ambient tracks that play while you are exploring the world of The Witcher. While these tracks serve their specific purposes, they are not songs that I would listen to over and over again because of how catchy, fun, or impressive they are. However, the reason the game is in 3rd place is because the other songs are so good that they hoist the entire OST up. In various interviews, Mikołaj Stroiński has talked about his influences for composing the soundtrack. Because it is a game about Polish folklore, it would surprise no one that it incorporated a lot of European folk music. Celtic music is one genre that makes a strong appearance in the game, specifically if you think about the songs that are playing when you are engaging in games of Gwent. And while Celtic music is strongly represented in many forms of popular media, it still feels unique in The Witcher. The instruments aren't limited to fiddles, flutes, and bagpipes, and also some non-verbal vocals, authentic-sounding mandolins, hurdy-gurdies, and cellos. You also hear the Celtic influences when you make your way up to Skellige, where the ambient and battle themes are unmistakably Scottish and Irish. However, I think there is one other element that I think tipped both the Gwent songs and the entire soundtrack from good to great, and to me, that is the Balkan influence. Until I did research for this video, I didn't really know why the Witcher music sounded vaguely Middle Eastern. I won't get into too much detail as I am no expert on the Balkans, but the Eastern vibes comes from using minor scales from Southeastern Europe, like the Hungarian minor scale and the double harmonic scale. Because the Balkans have historically been a major point of contact between Europe and Asian civilizations, the result is a rich culture that simultaneously evokes Turkic, Hellenic, and Western European elements. I'm not going to spoil anything, but if you've played the Ladies of the Woods series of quests in The Witcher, then you can understand how it was one of my highlights when I played the game. The story had been steadily leading me down to the swamps, and I was hearing more and more about these mysterious Ladies of the Woods and what they did, and the more I learned about them, the more intrigued I became. Finally, their theme started playing, and there they were, with the stunning character design, leading to the quest's crescendo. And even though I do not understand what the female vocalists are saying, I understand that things are about to get crazy. The track Silver for Monsters is probably my favorite in the soundtrack. The harmony and the arrangement of those Balkan influences with more traditionally Central and Western European medieval instruments, the powerful and aggressive vocals, it all comes together to create a track with such energy, and yet is so different from all other battle songs I have personally encountered in video games. The game's commitment to honoring the original book's grittiness and their very distinctive Central and Eastern European themes is only strengthened by the soundtrack and the originality, energy, and atmosphere it brings in. Now, number 2 and number 1 on my lists are very easily interchangeable. It was very difficult for me to decide which soundtrack gets the number 1 spot and which one gets number 2. Let's go with this. Number 2 goes to The Legend of Zelda, more specifically Ocarina of Time, though a lot of what I will say applies to many of the game's successors. There is nothing that I can say that has not already been said about the game's soundtrack. Aside from Ocarina of Time itself being a great video game that in many ways revolutionized the medium and introduced it to a lot of new mechanics and storytelling techniques, its soundtrack also greatly stands out. In my experience, Japanese video games can be really hit or miss when it comes to their soundtracks. I might get some flack for saying this, but I was never really a big fan of any of the Final Fantasy soundtracks, which sound similar to the Kingdom Hearts soundtracks. It's clear that a lot of effort went into composing them and performing them, and they definitely have their fans, however, they never really stood out to me as anything special. They are just different orchestral pieces that kinda sound samey after a while. There are exceptions, of course. The Shokubo theme is a classic one. A few of the battle songs are quite cool. Original Nintendo games, however, were always a little bit different. And they always had something in common as far as their soundtracks were concerned. They are oftentimes made to appeal to a broader age range, and there is often a certain whimsy to them. They don't really feel like they take themselves too seriously like many of the Final Fantasy games, and the soundtracks reflect that. Not only are a lot of the songs more lighthearted, but also lend themselves to many different genres and influences, keeping the soundtracks quite diverse. In Ocarina of Time, the land of Hyrule is divided into different biomes, and each one of them has their own distinctive visual styles, mood, and musical style. Gerudo Valley soundtracks is reminiscent of Andalusian guitar and percussion, and makes you think of the desert. Goron Village has a more easygoing vibe, which matches well with the Goron themselves, and has more of a Latin American influence to it. While Zora's Domain has a more dreamy and ethereal soundtrack. The market square inside Hyrule Castle has a very upbeat soundtrack, helping establish how young Link is still immature and views the world around him with childish naivete, only to be strongly contrasted by the bleakness of the world and its soundtrack after Link grows up, following the time skip. All in all, I won't spend too much time talking about Ocarina of Time's soundtrack, since it's a topic that's been done to death. There's a lot more videos that talk about this soundtrack with a lot more detail and analytical tone. So I'll talk about the honorable mentions. Some of my favorite video game soundtracks that didn't quite make it onto this list include Divinity 2, and I really like the option where you can choose your hero's instrument, be it an oud or a flute, a cello, and I forgot the fourth. I think it was some sort of mandolin. Fire Emblem Three Houses has a really cool soundtrack. Not all of it is so great to me. Some of the songs are very repetitive, especially the ones where you're in the monastery. Darkest Dungeon, to an extent, really helps establish that dark and gritty feel of the game, and Some of the battle soundtracks are really cool. Splinter Cell Chaos Theory is a great one. The composer Eamon Tobin, I'm not really sure how to pronounce his name, does such a great job at incorporating his own style into the game's soundtrack, and it's beautiful. Tropical 4, you know, that South American, specifically more Cuban influence, and just all of these songs, the salsa and etc. They sound great. Serial Cleaner, the soundtrack is just a funk album. That's all it is, but I love it. Funk from like the 70s. Stronghold 1 and Crusaders, that's a classic one. You know, a lot of the songs, I still remember them fondly, even though it's such an old game. Super Mario 64, you know, a classic, everybody knows about it. Just great songs in general. Fallout 3 and New Vegas, which when I first read my notes, I forgot why I added them on there, but it's really about the radio on your Pip-Boy. So some very cool tracks from, you know, the 1910s and the 1920s in America. And Journey, because no list about soundtracks is complete without adding Journey. Even though I don't really like it that much, like not enough to add it to my list, I still think it has a very, very beautiful soundtrack. Number 1 on my list is Undertale. Now thanks everyone for watching my video. Like I said at the beginning, it was difficult to make. It was a challenge to write. I spent a lot of time sort of looking over my writing and thinking, oh, this is not really good enough. But I decided to just record it, edit it, and publish it and see how it does. So yeah, if you like it, please do let me know. If you don't, then I'm gonna know. But it was a lot of fun creating, writing and filming and editing all of this, and hope to see you soon. Take care.